The South Florida Water Management District is paying $8.10 an hour to hunt the slithering creatures. They say the hunt is for a good cause, to save rabbits, raccoons, even deer that are being eaten up by all these pythons.
There is a battle happening right now in the heart of Florida that most people driving across the state on their way to a theme park or a beach resort have no idea is occurring. It is not being fought with bulldozers or chemicals or government agencies working from climate-controlled offices. It is being fought in the sawgrass in the black water, in the mud along canal banks, and in the hollow burrows beneath longleaf pines, by animals that have lived in this landscape for millions of years and are finally, after decades of losing, beginning to push back. The Florida Everglades is one of the most ecologically valuable places on the planet, a wetland system that provides services to the human population of South Florida worth an estimated $31 billion annually. It is also, for the past 3 decades, the site of the most destructive invasive species crisis in North American history. And the story of how that crisis is finally beginning to shift is one of the most remarkable biological dramas unfolding anywhere on Earth right now. To understand what is at stake, you have to understand what the Everglades actually does, because most people dramatically underestimate it. The system is not simply a scenic wilderness. It functions as the primary recharge mechanism for the Biscayne Aquifer, the underground freshwater reservoir that supplies drinking water to more than 8 million people across Miami-Dade, Broward, and Monroe counties. The Everglades filters that water as it moves slowly southward through limestone bedrock, removing pollutants and maintaining salinity levels that keep the aquifer viable. Engineers have calculated that replacing this natural filtration infrastructure with engineered alternatives would cost in the tens of billions of dollars to construct and billions more annually to operate. The system simultaneously provides flood protection valued at approximately $8 billion per year, absorbing the catastrophic rainfall events and storm surges that Florida's hurricane exposure produces with increasing regularity. On top of the infrastructure services, the Everglades supports a commercial and recreational fishery industry, a wildlife tourism economy, and a carbon sequestration function that researchers are only beginning to fully quantify. $31 billion is not an exaggeration. It may even be an undercount. This is what was put at risk when Burmese pythons began establishing themselves in the Everglades, and the story of how they got there involves 2 separate but reinforcing pathways that operated simultaneously. The first was a catastrophic accident. In August 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall near Homestead, Florida, as a Category 5 storm with sustained winds exceeding 165 miles per hour. Among the structures it destroyed was a reptile breeding facility near the edge of the Everglades, and the snakes that escaped into the surrounding wetlands during the chaos of that storm found themselves in a landscape that was, by every ecological measure, ideally suited to their biology. Warm, wet, densely vegetated, and filled with prey species that had evolved over millions of years without ever encountering a large constrictor. The second pathway was the pet trade. Through the 1990s, baby Burmese pythons were sold at reptile expos across Florida for as little as $10 each. They were small, visually striking, and easy to handle. What buyers consistently failed to anticipate was that these animals grow to lengths exceeding 12 feet and weights exceeding 100 pounds within a few years. As they became too large and dangerous to keep as pets, many owners chose to release them at the edge of the Everglades, a decision they likely framed to themselves as humane. In biological terms, it was the introduction of an apex predator into an ecosystem with no defenses against it. The consequences were captured in devastating detail by a 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which documented population declines across the mammal community of Everglades National Park that were almost incomprehensible in their scale. In the areas with the longest established python presence, raccoon populations had declined by 99.3%. Possums were down by 98.9%. Bobcat populations had fallen by 87.5%. Marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes had essentially disappeared from broad areas of the southern park. These were not gradual declines. They were collapses, driven by a predator that native mammals had never evolved any behavioral response to. A raccoon that has spent its entire evolutionary history learning to watch for aerial predators and aquatic ambush from alligators has no instinct that alerts it to a 15-foot snake lying motionless in the grass for 18 hours waiting for movement. The pythons were not hunting in ways that Florida mammals knew how to recognize or avoid. The result was a feeding opportunity that the snakes exploited with devastating efficiency. The state responded with programs that were creative, well-intentioned, and largely insufficient. The Florida Python Challenge, launched as an annual competition that pays participants for every snake removed, generated significant media attention but minimal ecological impact. In 2024, the event produced a total harvest of 195 snakes. Set against a population estimated conservatively at 300,000 individuals and possibly significantly higher, that number represents a rounding error. Professional removal contractors funded by the state have performed better. Since 2017, paid hunters have removed more than 23,000 snakes, but even this sustained effort likely represents less than 5% of the total population. The biological challenge is simply that Burmese pythons reproduce faster than they can be removed. A single female can produce up to 100 eggs in a single clutch, and in Florida's warm climate, incubation conditions are nearly optimal. Even under sustained removal pressure, reproductive output replaces losses faster than any realistically funded human program can match. The Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper that inhabits the same wetland and riparian environments as the species being decimated by the parasite, appeared to be largely unaffected. Cottonmouths were sharing water with infected individuals, consuming the same intermediate hosts, and living in identical habitat conditions, yet survey data consistently showed them free of the lung pathology destroying other species. The leading hypotheses involve either an immune response capable of neutralizing the parasite before it reaches the lungs, specific blood chemistry incompatible with the worm's survival, or biochemical properties of cottonmouth venom that create a physiological environment hostile to the parasite. Research into the cottonmouth's apparent resistance is ongoing and has attracted significant scientific interest, because if the mechanism can be identified and understood, it may offer pathways to protecting other vulnerable species through targeted intervention. The most significant development in the ecological fight against the python invasion, however, involves not a parasite study but a conservation success that took 40 years to achieve and is now producing consequences that could reshape the balance of species in South Florida. The eastern indigo snake, the largest native snake in North America, reaching lengths of up to 9 feet, was historically the dominant Ophiophagus, snake-eating, predator across the pine forests and scrublands of the southeastern United States. Its hunting strategy is direct and devastating: powerful jaws, a heavily reinforced skull, and the physical ability to seize another snake by the head and consume it alive and intact. The eastern indigo is completely immune to the venom of every pit viper native to Florida, capable of consuming diamondback rattlesnakes and cottonmouths without physiological consequence. It is, in the most straightforward biological sense, the animal that the Everglades ecosystem evolved to have at the top of its serpentine food chain. By the 1970s, it had been functionally eliminated from the northern portion of its range in Florida, driven out by the destruction of the longleaf pine ecosystem and the gopher tortoise burrow systems that the snake depends on for thermal regulation across seasons. For decades of conservation work, restoring longleaf pine habitat, protecting gopher tortoise populations, and implementing a captive breeding and reintroduction program coordinated between multiple conservation organizations, produced a documented milestone in late 2023. Trail cameras at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle captured footage of wild-born eastern indigo snake hatchlings, the first confirmed natural reproduction in the northern part of the state in approximately 50 years. These were not released animals. They were the offspring of naturally established wild pairs, demonstrating that the population had crossed the threshold from reintroduction project to self-sustaining wild population. The eastern indigo's range is now gradually expanding southward, moving toward the territory currently dominated by the Burmese python. No direct predator-prey interaction between the two species has yet been captured on camera in a natural setting, but the biological logic of the encounter is unambiguous. The indigo snake is a specialist predator of other snakes, immune to the defensive responses that other Florida predators must navigate, and capable of consuming snakes substantially larger than its own body diameter. While the indigo's return offers genuine hope, the picture is complicated by the same lungworm that is destroying other native snake populations. The parasite's northward spread has moved faster than the indigo's southward expansion, meaning the snake may be moving directly into territory already saturated with the organism. Whether the eastern indigo has the same apparent resistance as the cottonmouth, or whether it is susceptible to the same fatal lung pathology affecting other species, is one of the most consequential unanswered questions in Florida wildlife biology. If indigo snakes prove vulnerable to the lungworm, the organism could eliminate the state's most promising biological check on the python population before the two species ever come into sustained contact. The other dimension of the ecosystem's response has come from native predators that ecologists have documented developing new behavioral strategies toward pythons after decades of shared coexistence. A bobcat weighing approximately 25 pounds was documented on remote cameras killing and caching a python weighing more than 50 pounds, demonstrating not just opportunistic predation but stalking behavior, strategic attack angle selection, and food storage, a level of behavioral sophistication that represents genuine learned predator response rather than accidental encounter. American alligators, which initially appeared to occupy a competitive but largely non-predatory relationship with large pythons, have been increasingly documented ambushing pythons in aquatic environments. Raptors including red-tailed hawks and ospreys have been observed taking juvenile pythons from open areas. These observations do not represent population-level control, but they represent something ecologically important: the native community is no longer behaviorally naive toward the invader. The one-directional predation that characterized the first 2 decades of the invasion is giving way to a more complex ecological dynamic in which pythons face meaningful resistance from multiple native species simultaneously. Whether this combination of forces, the indigo snake's return, the native predator behavioral adaptation, the cottonmouth's apparent parasite resistance providing a potential research pathway, and continued human removal pressure, proves sufficient to shift the long-term population trajectory of the Burmese python in Florida is a question that ecology will answer over the coming decade. What is already clear is that the Everglades is not a passive victim of the invasion it has endured. It is a $31 billion biological machine, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, and it is deploying every mechanism available to restore a balance that a series of human decisions disrupted. The outcome is genuinely uncertain. But for the first time in 30 years, the uncertainty runs in both directions.